Today, we're looking forward to a very lively discussion about Alfred Hitchcock's 1956 film, The Man Who Knew Too Much. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our host for this talkback, the very talented author and film historian, Max Alvarez. Max?
Thank you, Norma, and good afternoon, everyone, friends and followers of New Plaza Cinema Online. It's a great pleasure to always talk about an Alfred Hitchcock film. When I first saw The Man Who Knew Too Much, it was on a Friday night, January 19th, 1973. My family and I were watching it on a black and white television in our basement on CBS television and thoroughly enjoying it. And had any of us Hitchcockians that evening suspected that it would be another 11 years before we could see the film legally, we would have been horrified because it was not available after that point. The Man Who Knew Too Much, the 1956 version that we're talking about today, was a part of a 5-film bundle whose rights reverted to Alfred Hitchcock after a certain number of years. And as a result, the films Rope, Rear Window, The Trouble with Harry, Vertigo, and The Man Who Knew Too Much remake were taken out of release and could not legally be shown until Universal Pictures reissued them to cinemas in the early 1980s. The second time I saw The Man Who Knew Too Much was at Universal Studios in 1984 on the eve of its theatrical reissue. Now, there's a big disagreement among Hitchcockians about which of the two versions, and there were two versions, the first being the 1934 British version, in which we had Leslie Banks in the Jimmy Stewart role and Edna Best in the Doris Day role. Which of the two is better? Well, everyone has their own reasons for preferring the 1934 version or the 1956 version. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. This story of a married couple traveling internationally whose child is kidnapped is the basis of a tremendous Hitchcock formula that merges excitement, humor, suspense, and heartbreak very, very effectively. And we will disagree as to which of the two versions handles each of those components in a superior fashion. But for starters, let's take a look at the original theatrical trailer for 1956. Now, this is going to be a very strange experience for all of us because it's a very odd assemblage of not very exciting scenes. But what appears to be the situation here is this is an early version of the trailer that was not shown in theaters. It's missing a very serious component: titles, the names of the actors, explosive phrases such as searing suspense, harrowing horror that would have been wiped across the screen as we see these background shots. But we do not have those titles today. We're going to just have to imagine them. So that the trailer seems a little more cumbersome than it would have originally appeared with all its opticals and optics intact. Let's take a look at the original trailer, which features Jimmy Stewart breaking down the fourth wall.
Ladies and gentlemen, the famous Miss Doris Day has gladly consented to sing a few songs for us tonight.
Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera.
You're right, that was a gunshot you heard. That was the signal that brought all the trouble out in the open. It's a scene from our new picture, The Man Who Knew Too Much. As you know, Alfred Hitchcock has an uncanny knack for coming up with the unusual in entertainment. Well, The Man Who Knew Too Much can certainly be put in that category. I play the part of an American doctor. Doris Day is my wife. And the story is about our trip abroad that started out as a holiday and ended up as a nightmare. And to film it, Hitchcock took us thousands of miles away from Hollywood to Marrakesh, which is right in the center of the North African trouble area. And that was just the beginning. From there, we flew to London for backgrounds of a whole strange series of events that ended up that final night in the great concert hall, where the cue for murder was one single crash of the cymbals.
Once again, I just have to imagine the titles that appeared on the screen. Never before has the master of suspense carried out such suspense. You can just imagine those words being wiped on and wiped off in yellow font during that trailer. The Man Who Knew Too Much was part of a remarkable series of films Alfred Hitchcock made at Paramount Pictures under a very unusual contract that afforded him tremendous creative control, although there were concessions that had to be made from time to time. This run of artistic and, for the most part, commercial successes began with Rear Window. It continued with To Catch a Thief and The Trouble with Harry, which did middling business in 1955, but had a good reputation. We, of course, have The Man Who Knew Too Much, and then we continue on to Vertigo 2 years later. This was the third collaboration between James Stewart and Hitchcock. Their collaborations having started in Rope in 1948 and then resumed with Rear Window in 1954, and Vertigo is going to come after today's film. So there were the usual Hitchcock technical repertory of technicians and technical geniuses behind the scenes, and we're going to learn more about them today. People like Herbert Coleman and Robert Burks, George Tomasini, Henry Bumstead, and a composer by the name of Bernard Herrmann, among others. This is more of a globe-trotting enterprise that Hitchcock was favoring at the time, as many studios were in the 1950s, with more and more big-budgeted films taking on travelogue-like personalities cinematically. So this is a film that I think invites quite a bit of discussion. I will be interested to hear what our guests have to say today. For me, it has a very awkward beginning where I feel it needs a little time to get into its, in the spirit of things. And I'll be talking more about that with our guests. I was watching the DVD the other day, which had a great making of piece in which Pat Hitchcock was interviewed. Production designer Henry Bumstead was interviewed. Screenwriter John Michael Hayes was interviewed. And there was this really charming, articulate guy who had all these interesting things to say about the film composer Bernard Herrmann. Now, I would be happy to summarize his words, but he's here with us today, and he can speak more brilliantly than I. I'm talking about Stephen Smith, who we heard on Wednesday give his fabulous Hitchcock's America online presentation for New Plaza. He's a 4-time Emmy-nominated documentarian and author. He specializes in Hollywood history. He's the author of music by Max Steiner, The Epic Life of Hollywood's Most Influential Composer, which was recently cited by Variety and BBC Music Magazine as one of the best books of 2020. He wrote a book about Bernard Herrmann called A Heart at Fire Center, which received a lot of research for the Oscar-nominated documentary on Bernard Herrmann called Music for the Movies. Stephen's been involved writing and producing over 200 documentaries for TV and other media, from The Sound of Music to about Martin Scorsese discussing Lawrence of Arabia, to, of course, sex, sin, and censorship in pre-code Hollywood. Needless to say, Stephen, we are so thrilled to have you back here at New Plaza Online.
Well, thank you, Max. It's a great pleasure to see you looking dapper as ever, and it was great fun speaking with people on Wednesday, and I'm very excited to hear what people have to say about this film today. And although someone might say, well, why this film if Wednesday was Hitchcock's America? This film has something to do with America. It was partly made in America. It was really made in three places, and that was Hitchcock's base at Paramount, Marrakesh, and London. And I think it's really 1955 to me is the most remarkable year of Hitchcock's career. That was the year that he shot this film, that it was edited, that the scoring was done. I think it was finished by year's end. And he had just launched his TV series. It launched in, I think, actually October of 55, right after the film was shot. And he was so busy, and and I'm so glad you mentioned all the people he was working with. His cinematographer, Robert Burks, his brilliant editor, George Tomasini, who later, of course, would cut the shower scene in Psycho, and so many others. Herman, who had only done one film score prior to this for Hitchcock, The Trouble with Harry. But all the right people came together, and that allowed him to make a film a year. And he was working on three movies at once. And going back through the papers on this film, I realized that when he was starting production on The Man Who Knew Too Much, the foreign version of To Catch a Thief was just being dubbed. That was 2 movies ago. The Trouble with Harry was still being promoted. That was his most recent movie. And he was prepping his next movie, and doing and overseeing, albeit not having a great deal of involvement, but some, in the television series. And it's remarkable to me that a film of this scope, this size, with so many scenes, could be made as quickly as it was. And I think it's due not only to the brilliance of Hitchcock, but for his uncanny ability to hire the right people, and how quickly and expeditiously they did their work, and how well they understood what he wanted. So that's something we can talk about if you like.
Because I was surprised, not that Wikipedia is the official source, but I was shocked that they listed the budget at 1.2 million, which is still only around $12 million today, remarkably inexpensive for a film of this scope with such major stars. But does that sound consistent with what you've just read about it?
Wikipedia is a good starting point, but I would say far from definitive. I would say I would refer people to the American Film Institute notes on films. Those are far more accurate, and the TCM site links to those. And I mean, Hitchcock ran a very tight ship. He was willing to spend money where he had to on a film. The place he didn't like spending a lot of money was on movie stars. That frustrated him that such a large part of the budget went to the actors. That said, he was also very eager to have James Stewart and Doris Day in this film. And Hitchcock felt very strongly about casting Doris Day. This was not a situation where people said to him, would you cast this singer? She's popular. He wanted her, and he was right, as I think those who've seen the movie know. And he and Stewart didn't really click on Rope, the first film they made together, because I think Stewart was miscast, and Hitchcock was so focused on that movie's novelty of 10-minute unbroken takes that they just didn't really connect on that one. Happily, they made Rear Window in 1954, and from then on, they had a very close relationship, and Stewart was eager to work on this film. By this time, Stewart was also taking a percentage of films' grosses, and he and Hitchcock had the same agent. They had the same talent agency, MCA, which just a short time after this would buy Universal Studios, and Hitchcock became the third highest stockholder in Universal Studios. So he's not only riding this artistic high, he is becoming incredibly wealthy. and I think so he felt very confident in the fact that the television series was so well received. I think you sense in this movie and the ones surrounding it a real sense of confidence. By the time you get to Vertigo, a sense to experiment. Even The Trouble with Harry, which he knew was not going to be a big commercial movie, he wanted to make it because he loved that kind of quirky sense of humor. So I think we're seeing Hitchcock in a peak period. And I have to admit, I'm not one of I can't say which movie is better because I think it comes down to personal taste. And the two versions are so different. The 1934 film reflects that snappy, swiftly paced, more modestly budgeted kind of British film he made, which I love. And this represents the glossiest, biggest Hitchcock movie And those are a lot of fun too, especially if you can see them on a big screen like New Plaza Cinema and with people.
And we'll be talking more about the big screen aspect shortly when Dan Cahill discusses the look of the film. But Hitchcock, of course, like any good British artist, was a master of understatement. And I remember him being asked one time about, someone was overwhelmed by the incredible quality of his 1950s films, one masterwork after another. And he just said, I was feeling very creative at the time.
Yes, yes. He liked to be understated.
He did. And there's a melancholy aspect to this film because this was the final collaboration between him and the screenwriter John Michael Hayes. They had collaborated on Rear Window, The Trouble with Harry, To Catch a Thief, and they had a falling out here over the matter of billing because Angus MacPhail, I believe, had worked extensively on developing the treatment with Hitchcock. And Hitchcock rightly felt that MacPhail did a major contribution to the structure of the film. Hayes felt he deserved or wanted single credit. And I believe it even went to Writers Guild arbitration, which was a big no-no in Hitchcock's book. So they never worked together after that, which is a shame.
That's true, and I'll just add to that Hitchcock's producer, Herbert Coleman, who wrote a fascinating autobiography, and I trust he's so accurate about so much and will admit to his own mistakes in his career that I trust him on this. He said that MacPhail was primarily working on the structure of the piece, and John Michael Hayes was the brilliant writer of dialogue, and that MacPhail actually continued to work on the film after Hayes demanded sole credit. And Hitchcock said to Coleman, and this was typical of Hitchcock, if you crossed him, he said, do we have everything we need from him, Herbie? Meaning Hayes. And he said, yes, Hitch, I think we do. And he said, pay him off, and I never want to see him again. And then let's bring Angus in. So if you crossed Hitchcock, and you could be very well just done, and he was cut out. And Hayes had a different point of view on it, others, but I think that's what actually happened. But what's also interesting is that this movie sort of blows up the myth that Hitchcock was bored making a film, that it was all just mechanical because everything had been worked out to the smallest detail. That wasn't true. This movie was still being written when production started. And the first location was Marrakesh. And Herbie Coleman, the loyal, he was called associate producer, but he was really Hitchcock's producer. He went to Marrakesh on his own, talked to the people he needed to. They were thrilled at the prospect of Hitchcock filming part of this movie there. They just said it has to be done well before Ramadan. It cannot be done. And that was a problem because they didn't really have a locked script at that point. And then in order to make those dates, they started shooting in Marrakesh before everything was really ready. And there were, as there often are on a big film, 2 units filming. And Hitchcock, Hitchcock loved to travel for publicity. He loved to see the world, have good meals, talk about how he did what he did with people. But he generally did not like filming on locations because you can't control them the way you can a studio. And I think Hitchcock would love the technology of today because the thing that he's sometimes criticized for, which are bad backplates or something, it reflects the time, but I think he was ahead of his time in anticipating how you could do so much work in the studio. The technology wasn't there. But he did go to Marrakesh, and he shot first unit for a few days with Doris Day and James Stewart. And Herbie Coleman oversaw a second unit. And Hitchcock got all the key material done with the stars, and then they left. But this was right before Ramadan. This is like 2 days. And Coleman stayed behind to get the necessary kind of color shots, the background shots, background plates, background images that they would superimpose the stars over for rear projection. And Coleman said that got scary because it was hours before Ramadan. And on the last, the government had soldiers with guns and rifles along the tops of the buildings because they were no longer wanted there. And they got out hours before they had to get out. And they were literally told, you have to stop filming now and leave. And fortunately, that was the most dramatic thing to happen behind the scenes on the film, because from there, the company went to London. And that, of course, was Hitchcock's native. That was his home. He loved Britain. They loved him. They shot much of the Albert Hall sequence, but not all of it, at the Albert Hall in London. and that went very well. And then, of course, they did as much as they could in studio at Paramount, including whenever, and this fooled me until quite recently, I have to admit. But whenever you're in the Albert Hall and you're seeing a box or a smaller area, they didn't spend time, renting or using a facility that is one of the most popular halls in Britain and remains so, because it's not only used for music concerts, now rock concerts, but there were at one time sporting events and everything you can imagine, conventions. So it was really difficult to get to spend too much time in the Albert Hall, and I think they did a brilliant job convincing you that whole, whatever it is, 12, 13-minute sequence was all filmed there.
You touched on some of the political themes, like having to make the film there on the eve of a very important holiday. There was some controversy about the portrayal of the Arab world in the film. Two interesting books, and by a professor by the name of Jack Shaheen, who's very critical of how the Arab culture is portrayed in film. He was not that thrilled with that opening scene on the bus where there was a statement about the Muslim faith. But what's fascinating in the book, Hitchcock's Notebooks, they quote some fascinating notes from Hitchcock, who wanted to tone down some of the original treatment of the Arab characters in that scene. He said, these are very out-of-date portrayals, because I think originally they were going to pay off the husband whose wife's veil had been ripped away. He said, no, you can't do that. And they were going to have Stewart's character make a big scene. And no, this man is a lot more worldly than that. So it was fascinating that Hitchcock was wanting to be more respectful of that culture.
I'm glad you brought that up, Max, because that's another really interesting aspect of Hitchcock for me. He is often criticized for a lack of logic or plausibility in films, or sometimes for having an old-fashioned sensibility. But regarding logic, he once said, logic is boring, which you could say is a bit of a cop-out, but he really saw his films as dreams that took place in realistic settings. And of course, why does Tippi Hedren go upstairs when she thinks the birds are up there? There's no good reason. I mean, you can take all the movies apart, but Hitchcock saw these films as emotional experiences, and he wanted people to be so emotionally involved that overrode the logical side of their brain. But I will also say, with respect to what you mentioned about his changing of the script with respect to Arabs, he did a tremendous amount of research on his films to know the reality of the culture of people, what even things like clocks sounded like, and what the chimes were like in places. I mean, he did incredibly journalistic research, had people do it, and then he would either use that as background or abandon that. But he always wanted to root his films in a real place, so that when things took on a completely, sometimes surreal or extreme quality, he wanted you to at least feel that you were in a real place. So yeah, I think I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and then the only other thing before we get to our next participant, Daniel, is although Hitchcock had a lot of control over his pictures, there was the Paramount front office he had to deal with. And I think this may have been in the McGilligan biography of Hitchcock, that Paramount actually insisted on removing a lot of the Cold War content from the screenplay, because it was more clear in the original script, apparently, that these were communist figures who were involved in the kidnapping and so forth. Paramount was concerned about antagonizing the foreign market, so there were references to Hungary and the Soviet Union that were deleted. And in a way, I think that makes the film a little bit less dated in that sense, and a little bit more universal.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And to be honest, I don't know about that. I do know that if he felt something was really necessary, he fought for it. And Paramount, for example, 4 years later, was very against the making of Psycho, but they didn't say don't make this film. Hitchcock put up his own money, and Paramount did one of the great advertising campaigns of all time for that film, engineered by Hitchcock, but they fully supported him. So Paramount was overall a great place for him. They might have pushed back on a few things. Certainly the censors did, even more than Paramount. Hitchcock had to satisfy them. But Hitchcock, I think, enjoyed working with playing with the censors. And he did the thing that everyone did. He put in things that he knew they would cut out, so he could secretly keep the thing that he didn't want them to cut out. Not so much on this film, but certainly on a film like Psycho. So anyway, so much to discuss about an interesting man at an interesting time.
And the Paramount films of his have such an outstanding production look to them because Paramount had such a high quality of production and quality to their films. And that does tie into the visual look of the film. And that does tie in to our next participant, Dan Cahill, who's going to discuss the photographic look of The Man Who Knew Too Much. Dan is an award-winning filmmaker with a master's degree in film and TV production from NYU. He has decades of experience working in screenwriting, directing, editing, and cinematography. He's a member of the Writers Guild. He's taught directing at the New York Film Academy. And finally, how cool is this? He conducted a filmmaking workshop in Morocco. Who better to talk about The Man Who Knew Too Much and its visual look? Welcome back, Dan.
Thank you for the detailed intro, Max. Indeed, this is my favorite Hitchcock film, and one of the strong personal reasons for that is that I lived in Morocco for 2 years. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I did not live in Marrakesh, but I visited it extremely often. And so the movie has a lot of serious personal attachment for me. If I can just get it up, okay. Now I need to start the slideshow. There we are. There we are. Okay. The Man Who Knew Too Much, a brilliant film. Before I go into the film itself, I have to spend a minute on Vista Vision, a process that was created by Paramount, hence the mountain in the background here. And the basic principle is that traditional 35mm motion picture film would run through a camera vertically from top to bottom. And there'd be a reel on the top and a reel behind that would catch the film. Vista Vision ran the film horizontally through the camera. And the goal was to create a larger frame in the negative. If you think about the geometry of it, it'll become clear, but I'm not going to get that detailed. This is incidentally the same technology that created IMAX, using a larger film size in 70mm. Now, one result of this is that the slides I'm going to be showing you are much finer grained, clearer, sharper, and I hope the difference will be perceived by you. This is a shot in the hotel room set in California, I'm assuming. That big behemoth behind Hitchcock is a Vista Vision camera. And so imagine trying to move that thing around when you are trying just to do a simple camera move. It was complicated. The guy who made all this visual stuff work is the gentleman on the left, Robert Burks, who filmed a total of 12 films for Hitchcock, beginning with Strangers on a Train and ending with Marnie. And Hitchcock himself made 5 films in Vista Vision, so he was clearly sold on it. Well, here's one of my personal reasons. This is the main square in Marrakesh. It's called Jamal Fana, which stands for Square of the Dead. Back in medieval times, and yes, the city is that old, they used to execute people here publicly. Note the big mosque in the background. That is the Kutubia Mosque. Here is their bus arriving at Jamal Fana. I have taken a bus that looks exactly like that and stops right there. It's really sends me over the moon. Here we have an example of rear projection. Stewart and Day are in a studio in America, and that is a background plate that was filmed by the second unit from a car going through these streets. So that is one thing that they struggled with. This is the Hotel de la Munia, at its time, the luxury hotel in Marrakesh. Winston Churchill had stayed there. Now there are others competing with it, but it's still around. And I would like you to note the French tricolor flag on top. Morocco at this time in 1955 was still a French protectorate. And some of the turmoil in shooting in Marrakesh was due to the fact that Morocco was struggling for its independence, which it achieved in March of 1956, not too long thereafter. But it was, compared to Algeria, it was a very peaceful transition. Algeria became a bloodbath, but we don't have to talk about that. I love this shot. First of all, it's authentic, shot live on location. Anytime a director can have interaction between two or more actors and they're facing the camera, he or she is going to love that. It means they don't have to do a lot of back and forth cutting, making it look artificial. Here we see the first encounter between the Draytons and the McKennas. I love this shot. I know it's a painting. It's just artificial as it can be, but it takes me back to nights in Morocco, which can be absolutely beautiful. Speaking of beautiful, this man isn't. This is Reggie Nalder playing the assassin. And he is originally from Vienna. The camera dollies in on him. That huge camera moves in on him. And this is a face that is haunting. I first saw the film when I was the same age as Hank in the movie. This was on its original release, and that face haunted me. We'll be seeing it again in a few more slides. One more aspect of Moroccan life, which is very authentically handled here. In the high-end restaurants, they will bring a kettle of warm water and a basin so you can wash your hands at the table. And it somehow makes the food taste a lot better. Really an elegant experience. This is just an example of the kind of street activity that you have in Jamal Fana. The man in the hat on the right is a water seller, and he has a big goatskin bag full of water, and he pours it out in the brass cup that is hanging around his neck. Here we see the McKennas on the lower right with their backs to the camera watching acrobats. Now this is authentically filmed with the stars in the foreground and actual acrobats in the background. This, however, features acrobats on rear projection because the dialogue had not been written yet. So they didn't know what dialogue to film. And oh yeah, you'll note on the left side of the frame, there's a rather chubby gentleman standing there with his back to the camera. I think we know who that is. Now, here is an example of a live dialogue scene being filmed in the marketplace. And here is the proof. There is Hitchcock observing the filming. And we know they shot live dialogue because of the mic boom at the top of the frame. This is not live filmed. The background is a rear projection plate. And this is when they have the discussion about, oh, somebody's tonsils financed their vacation, and she asks, when are we having another baby? None of that dialogue had been written when they were originally filming. So they put them in a studio, beautifully lit by Robert Burks to match the background. Okay, here comes an explanation of something that will be mysterious to all American viewers. What is the bit with the blue paint in this chase scene? And I'll talk you through it. This is the Dyer's Souk in Marrakesh. Souk meaning a small market, dyers being people who dye things, such as these skeins of wool. They are colored and they are hung over the street to dry out. This presents a very picturesque look, and it is in itself a tourist attraction. I've been there a few times. It is quite lovely, especially when the sun is shining right through the wool. Now, what happens in the chase scene is that Louis Bernard, played by Daniel Gelin, collides with a man carrying not paint, but blue dye for the wool. And he slips and falls into the dye, and runs off with people pursuing him. Now, why did they do this? Well, Hitchcock's intention, and it doesn't take but a millisecond to go, oh yeah, that's a Hitchcock idea, was that the people pursuing Louis Bernard would follow the blue footprints on the street. Well, they never shot the viewpoint of the blue footprints on the street. I think they were in such pressure to get out of Marrakesh that they decided they didn't really have to have it. But that's what the blue color is all about. Here is another example of something that didn't quite work out as it should have. This is Louis Bernard's face, and Stewart's fingers are trying to grab his head as he slips down. And the idea is that he is wiping the brown makeup off of Gelin's face. Well, that didn't work. They couldn't get the makeup to come off. So Gelin suggested, let's put some white powder on Stewart's fingers and have him overlay the powder over his face. And it worked beautifully. We believe it. One last touch of the blue dye on Jolin's hand as he is losing his life. I love this detail. This is in the Moroccan police station while Stewart is waiting for the evil Mr. Drayton to call the hotel and see if his wife and Hank have arrived. The tension in one hand, grasping a phone book, is powerful, works for me. Speaking of powerful things that work for me, here is Doris Day, a lifelong underrated actress, giving the performance of a lifetime. Here she is just starting to realize what her husband is telling her about what happened with Hank as she's fighting off the sedative that he has given her. A couple of other scenes here from the same long scene. This is one of the hardest scenes anybody ever shot. And I just read today that on the day they were filming this in the studio in California, they blocked the actors for the camera, then took a lunch break and came back and filmed it in one take. A high angle shot indicates vulnerability. If you're looking down on somebody, they look helpless. And this is the perfect moment for that when they are hearing more bad news about Hank. This, I think, is from the London Scotland Yard. Once again, back in London, Stewart is on his way to Ambrose Chapel. He hears footsteps behind him. It doesn't amount to anything. It's a red herring, but it's another moment of tension, which Hitchcock loves to insert. Another moment of tension comes in the taxidermy shop. What else to put in the frame with Stewart other than a snarling tiger's head, into which his wrist is thrust moments later? Here is a good scheme for how to break up with your fiancée. You have to show her this picture, or him, and say, honey, I've made all the arrangements. This is the little chapel where we're going to get married. This is the grimmest looking building I could imagine, darkly lit. Ugh, who wants to go in there? Well, somebody whose son has been kidnapped, clearly. Reggie Nalder is back, looking very sophisticated, tying his own bow tie for the formal concert. Few people can actually do that. This is Bernard Miles, character actor from stage and screen, playing the minister at Ambrose Chapel. And there was debate with the studio about how to clothe him. So they filmed him, every shot of him, twice, once with this clerical collar and once with a necktie. So I guess the clerical collar passed muster at the Paramount head office. Well, what have we here? We have Jimmy Stewart in a bell tower. I think Hitchcock liked this concept so much he was going to use it again 2 years later. And boy, it sure looks like Stewart is experiencing vertigo in this particular scene. I love when Hitchcock sneaks something in the background, a poster for the concert we're going to hear. The Storm Cloud Cantata by Arthur Benjamin, conducted by, yes, that's Bernard Herrmann's name. Here we have Reggie one more time, scoping out his victim. The symbols themselves, powerfully, powerfully photographed. Now, once again, I read for this scene that Doris did all of her reactions in one take. I love this particular shot for Robert Burks' lighting. Note the quote unquote normal exposure on the red curtain. Then note the highlight on the metallic pistol that he's holding, and just enough light to discern who he is and what his intentions are. Superb cinematography. Doris is helpless. One take. This is Bernard Herrmann conducting the orchestra right before the climax. And the scream heard round the world, powerful. We're now at the embassy of a mysterious country which begins with A-O. Can't imagine what that would be. Somebody made it up. After Doris starts singing Que Sera Sera, the camera moves up the stairs in the embassy, showing us where Hank is hidden on the top floor, getting to smaller and smaller staircases and hallways. Doris hears Hank's whistle. Another brilliant facial reaction from her. Jimmy Stewart restraining himself from cheering and yelling that his son has been found. This shot gets me every time. It's a 3-shot of 2 people and a third character, a pistol. And Stewart is yearning just to reach out and hug his son again, but he has to hold back. And Stewart's face tells it all. My favorite tagline at the end of any movie is, "We had to go and pick up Hank." I just love it. I have a very quick bonus for you. A 2015 film starring Ian McKellen as the title character here. The great detective is portrayed in retirement as a beekeeper on the Sussex Downs. And somebody, perhaps the director, Bill Condon, wanted to use this shot of a woman that Holmes is trailing who stops to look in a store window. And if you can squint real hard or zoom in, it says on the window, Ambrose Chapel Taxidermy. That's all I got for you today, folks. The legacy of the man who knew too much lives on in present day cinema.
You're the historian who knows too much, Dan. That's absolutely extraordinary, right down to the Ambrose Chapel reference.
I remember seeing that live in a cinema, and I was probably the only person who laughed out loud at it, but there you go. Hope you enjoyed it.
That was wonderful.
That was fantastic. And I have so many questions for you gentlemen about, especially when we get to the music portion of the film and the Albert Hall scene. Just a couple of quick notes about the actors, some of the supporting roles. Dan had mentioned Daniel Jalin, who played Louis Bernard. He had acted previously for French filmmakers Jacques Becker, Sacha Guitry, and also the German filmmaker who came to France, Max Ophuls. He was in La Ronde and also Le Plaisir. And he's going to continue to act in France right up through his death in 2002. And the double-crossing British couple was played by, as Dan mentioned, it was Bernard Miles, who previously had been seen in several films by David Lean, In Which We Serve and Great Expectations. The wife, Brenda de Bonzi, had also appeared in a David Lean film, Hobson's Choice. And the very creepy assassin, Reggie Nalder, was a Viennese dancer and a stage actor. Apparently, Hitch's instructions to him during the Albert Hall sequence was something to the effect of, gaze at your victim as if you're gazing at a beautiful woman. So those are words to the wise.
Yeah.
We saw
I always do that. I always do that.
I always knew that. That's a given, right?
It is. Yeah.
And then the friends who were waiting for them in the London hotel room included the veteran actor Alan Mowbray and Carolyn Jones, who will be appearing on The Addams Family on television.
And Hilary Brooke. We can't forget the lovely and talented Hilary Brooke is in that ensemble.
Thanks for mentioning that. And then Christopher Olson, who played Hank, he did mostly TV work after this film. His last credit was in 1960. So, gentlemen, thoughts on the music? You had mentioned in the behind the scenes documentary, Stephen, that this was a pretty low-key Herman score.
Well, there is not much original Herman underscoring for a good reason. The centerpiece of the film is going to be a concert work. It's going to take place at the Albert Hall, and the rest of the film did not need much music. So the first thing they had to do on this project was decide what music are we going to use for the Albert Hall sequence. And Herman either introduced or was 100% supportive of the idea of keeping the original work by a composer he greatly admired, Sir Arthur Benjamin, who had written the Storm Clouds cantata for the 1934 Hitchcock film. It was reorchestrated, it was made bigger, and so I think that's a sign of how Bernard Herrmann's, he didn't have the kind of ego that said, oh, I'm going to write all this music, I get to show myself off. And it's also a sign of how much Alfred Hitchcock loved the music for The Trouble with Harry, which would be Hitchcock's favorite of all of his Herman scores, that after that one collaboration, he had so much faith in Herman, he didn't just hire him to score his next movie, he hired him to be someone that he couldn't cut out of the key sequence in the film. And they had really formed an instant bond on The Trouble with Harry. And so, yes, when it came to scoring the rest of the film, first they pre-recorded the music of the Storm Clouds cantata in London, so it's all being done to playback, of course. And then they also scored, I think, at the same time, the main title of the film, which is a little almost concert overture in and of itself, a very short one. And then the rest of the music, the film was shot, edited, and Benny, as he would with all the Hitchcock films, was around reading the scripts, surfing the refrigerator at Hitchcock's office, turning up at all hours. He was always part of the production throughout. He felt that that helped him write a better score if he could see how scenes were being shot and talk with Hitchcock. And then when it came to the final writing of the movie, Hitchcock had so much faith in him that he left the overseeing of the actual scoring, the recording of the instrumental music, which in those days meant hearing the instrumental music for the first time. He left that to Herbert Coleman, while Hitchcock left to, I think, promote The Trouble with Harry elsewhere. I mean, again, he had like 3 movie projects going at once, along with the TV show, but he felt comfortable enough to go out of the country and leave the last of the post-production. The music to in the hands of others. So that's really all I can say about the music. It was a very happy experience for everyone involved on that side of it.
I just want to cite my favorite original music cue is when Louis Bernard emerges from the alleyway grasping at the knife in his back, and Stewart sees him for the first time. It is some of the most intense Bernard Herrmann music I can recall.
It is. Thank you, Daniel. And it's a sign of how it's better to have music that's effective in where you need it than having a lot of it. Oh, and this is a chance for me to mention that for the very first time, the complete score, the Herrmann underscoring for The Man Who Knew Too Much, is getting what I know will be a spectacular modern-day re-recording, because it's being conducted by the very best person to do this, a man named William Stromberg, who's been doing this for decades. And he and his wife, Anna Bond, restore with my colleague John Morgan the original parts, and they're recording it, I believe, in Scotland, and that recording will be coming out in the next year or so, along with another big Herrmann score. So it's nice that these just the interest has not diminished, as I think today's attendance and our conversation shows.
Would you let us know when that is released? Often it's hard to know these
Sure.
dates before they happen. I want that.
And then we can let people know. And then, of course, we have to identify the hit song that emerged from the film, although it's credited in the titles, as I believe, as What Will Be, but we know it as Que Sera, Sera.
Yes, Paramount, we've talked about Paramount's influence. Paramount wanted to have a hit song in this movie, and Hitchcock was in complete agreement, because he thought it was logical that if Doris Day was going to play a singer, she should have a song. And there's the famous story that Livingston and Evans, who'd written so many hit songs, Oscar-winning songs, standards, you can look them up online. He hired them and said to them, "Gentlemen, I don't know what kind of a song you are to write, but Paramount wants a popular song. Will you go write it?" And they thought about it, read the script, and they wrote several songs, including Que Sera, Sera. And Hitchcock famously, this was as big a compliment as you could get from Alfred Hitchcock. He heard it and said, "Gentlemen, you may recall that I told you I did not know what kind of song I wanted. That is the kind of song I wanted." And he walked out. And that was more. As Herbert Coleman said, and I love Alfred Hitchcock movies. I'm not knocking him. He was a complicated person, but he was famous for not saying thank you to people. If he liked a script, he would say to the screenwriter, "Alma liked it very much." When someone did a good take, he would say, "We have it," and that was the sign to move on. So he was really almost deliberate in his withholding of approval. And there's a famous story Doris Day told her. The main story she told about this film was that she was a singer who became an actress, and she didn't believe in it. She was insecure about her incredible talent as a dramatic actress, and Hitchcock did not give direction if he was pleased with something. And day after day after day, he said nothing to her, and she was convinced that she was giving a terrible performance. And Jimmy Stewart even said, "Don't worry, Doris, he'll let you know if he doesn't like something." But she finally said, "Mr. Hitchcock," and you can look up the anecdote because she tells it so well. I'm so insecure. I'm feeling so terrible. I feel like I'm letting you down. And that's when he apparently said something that it was. I think it was truthful. He probably said it to put her at ease, but I think he was telling the truth when he said, "You think you're frightened. I'm frightened every day. When I walk through the Paramount commissary, I'm terrified. I'm terribly afraid that someone is going to say something hurtful to me. We all are I'm a very frightened person too. And after that, they got along better. But I think that is true of Hitchcock. I know that if Alma, his wife, who was, the person who signed off on everything he did, she was very pleased with Vertigo, but she said there was one shot in the movie she didn't like that she thought wasn't flattering to Kim Novak. And apparently Hitchcock then said to someone later, Alma hates the movie. He just was so sensitive. And unlike Bernard Herrmann, who was just this raw nerve of explosion and emotion and tears and anger and positive feelings too, a very, very sensitive man, Hitchcock created that brilliant facade of calm and implacability. But I think that he had the same feelings that we all do. He was just a genius at keeping it inside.
One other Doris Day bit that I have to share is that she initially did not like Que Sera Sera. She thought it was a crummy song, but it became the biggest hit of her lifetime, her signature tune. It won the Oscar, and I'm sure she ended up performing it at every live performance. It's one of those things you have to do at some point in the show.
Well, I think the world is divided into two people: those who love Que Sera Sera as this whimsical, charming story of youthful innocence, and those who find it the most saccharine, treacly 1950s hit. And I remember when I saw the film for the first time and she's singing in the hotel room, I'm going, oh, Hitch, what's wrong with you? But then when the song appears later on at the embassy, and it's that magnificently edited scene as Que Sera Sera is being sung, and it gets softer and softer as we go up the stairs, you can't help but be in awe of this piece of music and how brilliantly Hitchcock used it. So everyone becomes a convert to Que Sera Sera after seeing the film.
And there is, by the way, a very, very good book. It's probably about 10 years old now, called Hitchcock's Music. And it is revelatory, to use a word that Stephen has chosen for us sometimes, in how often the music plays a role in the plot. For example, Que Sera Sera, we have to know that song from the beginning of the film in order for it to work at the end. And the other instances of it are just all over the place. He knew how to use music very, very well.
And this is a film about music. I mean, music is being used to potentially assassinate someone.
Yeah.
Yes.
In a sense. The film, by the way, was number 18 at the box office in 1956. So it did well, but other films did much better, as often was the case for Hitchcock's work.
But it made a lot of money, and everybody was very pleased with it, and it did well internationally too. So this was the kind of movie that even later, when he went to Universal and MCA, would exert more and more, let's say, influence in projects. This is the kind of movie they wanted him to make, and that's why those later attempts to do the international thrillers weren't as successful, because this and even better for me, they're both great. North by Northwest, he had really done everything he could in this kind of film, I think, with those movies.
So I'm going to just stir up a little bit of argument before we get to our questions. I'll be the bad boy here.
Go ahead.
Love this picture. I feel he dropped the ball at the beginning in the bus scene. I think it is the most unexciting opening for a Hitchcock movie. After the titles, we kind of cut to Jimmy and Dora sitting in the back of the bus. I was expecting some shots of Morocco, the bus winding down roads through the marketplace. We go through the bus. We start off with the driver in his local garb. We see the couples, the veiled women, and then we see the Americans. And we don't see that. And I just felt it was a very uninspired opening, but then it picks up beyond that. Gentlemen?
I will just vouch for the authenticity of the background footage on the bus. I have been on those roads, and they knew what they were doing. They passed through the occasional little village, and, oh, look, there's a camel. So they got the background footage right.
The rest of the stuff, is very impressive.
Yeah. The rest of the stuff, not so much, but.
For me, dramatically, this movie does not pull me in until the murder and the kidnapping, and then it finally gets to momentum. And Hitchcock liked to begin things quietly and slowly quite often, and it's very effective. But this, for me, I agree with you, Max. The Act One is not one that when I'm watching as always with an audience, things play better. but I find it not an overly compelling movie until we really get into the action of it.
It just had the opening reel had a bit of a rough cut feel to me. I just felt that they were still tweaking it. And then beyond that, it took off. And the shot that Daniel mentioned, the close-up of Stewart's fingers fingering the book or whatever it is, a director
book, I think.
That's where I started really getting involved in what's going on. So, well, I know we have questions. I'll respond to one note. Someone wanted to know why this is not available on Paramount Plus. Well, Paramount no longer owns the film. It's actually owned by Universal, as were some of the other Hitchcock titles from that era. But we can address other questions and at this time. But a reminder that, Stephen, we're going to be seeing you shortly, right? Your next presentation is for us.
It's coming up. People will be sick of me.
No, yes. Never, Stephen.
Never, Stephen. Never, ever.
Very kind. Well, yes, I'm going to be doing a talk about Orson Welles' infamous radio broadcast of The War of the Worlds on December 30th, 1938. And if you think you know this story, if you really think you don't want to hear any more about it, you've got some surprises in store, because a sociologist author in 2017, whose name I'm blanking on, but we'll say several times during the talk, he found hundreds of pieces of correspondence to CBS, to the FCC, and I had interviewed many of the people involved in the original show when I was writing my book about Bernard Herrmann, who was the musical director and conducted the music on that broadcast. And there is a fascinating story about that night, which I tell in the present tense, and which has incredible relevance to our age of fake news, of people believing things selectively, of why some people were sucked into this this incredibly implausible story in such a short time. And and who Orson Welles was, just exploding on the scene, and how that movie made Citizen Kane possible. So I do hope people come back for that. Thank you.
We will be there
with bells on.
With bells
if anyone has a question, please go to the reaction button and raise your hand. Right now we have Joshua. Joshua, if you'd like to unmute and start your video. Hi, Joshua.
Okay. Couple of things. First of all, I think in a previous section, you may have mentioned the Edwin White book of Hitchcock.
I mentioned it Wednesday, yes.
Which I bought and read. And the author points out that someone said that Hitchcock viewed everything as a boy with a nightmare. And that pretty much says it. Doris Day was never my favorite actress. In this movie, she won her spurs as far as I was concerned. Mary Rogers just came out with a book, co-authored, about the use of music, in the importance and the use of music on not only in Broadway, but in the movies. And I commend that book to anyone who hasn't read it, on how important music really is. And you were talking about, Daniel, about the realistic use of the market and what have you.
Yes.
The death mark. What I was thought of when you were talking about that was the movie The Day of the Jackal. And that also had, an awful lot in terms of the ramifications of the French leaving North Africa. Anyway, I wanted to say, I appreciate you guys. I learned so damn much in each one of these sessions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
God bless all of you.
We appreciate you, Joshua. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much.
Edward Jones. Could you?
Yes, hi, that's me. And I second the sentiments of that gentleman. I think you guys are doing a terrific job. I just love these seminars, and I can't wait till I get into the theater itself. I want to just defend, if I could, the opening sequence. you know, here we have this this boring family from Indianapolis, and their costumes, the hat, the suit, et cetera, not knowing what is going on around them in this foreign land. I mean, they're completely, if I could say, ignorant of customs there. And all of a sudden, the little boy, you know, falls into the woman and grabs her veil, and all hell breaks loose in the back of this bus, you know, and they don't know what is going on. They don't know what happened. They don't, and so it sets up Bernard, who comes in as the interlocutor, interpreter, and explainer of the customs, and that really sets up what's to follow. All the commotion and craziness of the murder in the square, and it just goes on and on from there. So I kind of really went with the. Initially, I was annoyed, but as it picked up, I really understood what was happening. The second thing I just wanted to say is about the song. I almost felt that the song was a character in the film, the way it was used and the way it came out in different appearances, you know, and particularly the starting off being sung to the little boy to calm him from his mother, and then ending up pointing the way to the would-be murderers and the rescue. So just want to throw that out. But anyway, thanks again. Brilliant afternoon. Thank you.
Wonderful observations, Edward. Thank you so much. Great observation.
Hold on.
I just say, I think it speaks to the fact Hitchcock knew his audience, and he did make films for the world. But what Edward said is right. He knew that the way for an American audience to get into this movie would be to take a typical American couple and show that they had no idea what was going on around them, so that things could be explained and you know, and carry the audience in that way. So he was absolutely right.
Anthony, get out of the way.
A couple of comments from the audience. Someone had noted that Que Sera Sera was actually whistled in The Lady Vanishes. No?
There was music whistled in it, but not that song.
Yeah, that song was not written. That was a 1938 film, and I'm sorry, not to forgive me for correcting whoever it is, but this song was written in 1955 for this movie.
Oh, okay. And someone also noted that they thought it was rather strange in the 50s to see a kid held at gunpoint.
It was unusual, and it was something, the original production code that was fully enforced in July of 1934, 4 years after it was written, it said that children couldn't be endangered. I mean, I'm definitely paraphrasing it, but there was a section in there in the wake of the Lindbergh kidnapping. I think they even strengthened it, but yeah, normally you did not see children put in that kind of jeopardy, and I think it speaks to the loosening of the code by the mid-50s, the fact that you had foreign films challenging American films at the market, movies that were much more explicit in every way. You had television encroaching on movie box office, and by the early 60s, the production code is kind of a joke, and that is an early example, and Hitchcock loved breaking taboos, like showing a toilet in Psycho, you know, 5 years later. But yeah, it is very unusual, and that's a shot in the movie, no pun intended, because thank goodness there's no shot, but that image is one that made me gasp the first time I saw it, and I still feel incredibly uncomfortable watching. You do not see that in movies at the time. You're quite right.
It kind of leads, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
It leads me to my comparing the two films, and I haven't seen the original 34 version in a long time, but I feel the remake is more emotionally involving, and it's more touching in terms of what the couple is experiencing. But the original is more frightening because, let's face it, one of the kidnappers is Peter Lorre. to have your daughter in this case kidnapped by Peter Lorre is one of the most horrifying images any moviegoer could have. And the British couple in this film, well, they're not as menacing or as frightening, and we don't get as much of a sense of the child in danger after the child disappears as we did in the original film, where you actually I do recall, well, the kidnapped child was played by the actress with my all-time favorite movie name, Nova Pilbeam. That was her real name. And I do recall you seeing her in a carriage or a vehicle of some kind with a hand is covering her mouth. It's a very frightening image.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to balance the different emotional responses we get from the two versions.
Max, I had a quick question for you. The trailer that you showed, did I see some sign of magenta vision in it?
Well, okay, so it was definitely a low quality trailer. It doesn't even look like what we would call color corrected.
Right,
So
right.
you had some shots that were definitely, the color was off, and this clearly was something, it was an early version that had not been finalized yet, because of course it didn't have the titles on it or anything.
Just so everyone knows what that is, early color film didn't hold the dye lot very well. And as it aged, you got something called magenta vision, where the image turned very pink. And you won't know what I'm talking about now, but the first time you see it after I mention it, you'll be like, oh, that's magenta vision, you know? So.
And I'll just say Technicolor, 3-strip Technicolor did hold up very well, but it was just too expensive. And then when Hollywood switched to Eastman color in the 50s, that's when we start to get, the magenta vision look.
And you also know you're being, monkeyed around with when in the opening shot of the trailer, the guy at the embassy says, Miss Doris Day. Well, and you can see his mouth saying Joe Conway, but
I could see Hitchcock saying, let's take that a second time, but this time mention Doris Day. We can use that for the trailer.
Maybe.
Okay, Norma, you had a question?
Well, actually, it is,
it's Janice.
Janice
Bogart has a question, and I'm trying to get my video on so you can see her.
But at the very least, we could hear.
But I'm unable to start my video. Can you allow me to start my video?
I'm looking.
Or we can just hear. Go ahead and ask the question, Janice, and we can take it from there.
You do know me. But I was really going to make a couple of statements. I saw this film when it first came out in London, when on a date with a new boyfriend. I'm 5'2", and the man was 6'4". And it was raining, and he held the umbrella over his head so that I got drenched. As we came into the movie, I was in a very bad mood. And as soon as they started playing Que Sera Sera, I thought, oh God, this is ghastly. This is the worst song I've ever heard. Oh, and I hate their pronunciation. Oh, this is going to be a disaster. And I hate the man I'm with. He was quite lovely, actually. But anyway, so then I noticed how the makeup looked awful. That the makeup, when they were sitting in the back of the taxi, they looked very, very pinkly made up. And I thought, who did this makeup? It's not the usual beautiful stuff that we're used to seeing. And I was quite ignorant at that time. It's just that I loved movies and always adored Hitchcock, still do. The other thing was, oh yes, it's the usual story about this very American couple. It was a long time ago, and I'm very English at that time. And it's this ghastly American couple, and he's absolutely straight up and good, and she's the hysterical wife. Can't stand hysterical wives, still can't stand hysterical wives. And this is going to be a disaster. I hate this movie, I hate this man, and I want to go home. I had the best time. As soon as they entered the Albert Hall, I was very, very happy, baby. And I thought it was wonderful, except for the child, who was so raucous and what we call them American smartass is what we called them then. I hated the child, but this was 1950, whatever. That's when everybody behaved in that way. So for sitting as I do now, I understand why they were so awful, in my opinion, which is not always right. I thank you.
That was brilliant.
I would like to follow up on Janice's comments about seeing it for the first time. I am 2 months younger than Christopher Olson, the actor who played Hank. So I saw this. This was the first Hitchcock feature film that I saw in a theater on its first run on a big screen. And talk about identifying with a character on the, here I am 9 or 10, and there he is 9 or 10 getting kidnapped and guns pointed at him and everything. So the movie really resonated with me, and I think that's a key ingredient on why it's my favorite Hitchcock.
That is wonderful. But you're forgiven because you were probably a rotten American kid too.
Yeah. Something wrong with that?
I love it. I love it.
Janice,
And now I have lots of them.
well, when Janice talked about believe me, Janice, you're not alone here. This couple they're the exact type of American tourists I tend to run from whenever I'm traveling internationally, you know. But you described her as kind of a hysterical wife. It's fascinating comparing the two women in the two different versions, because in the 1934 version, the Edna West character, I mean, she's a sharpshooter. She's very take charge, and she actually ends up taking out one of the villains, or she's like an action hero in the original film. Fascinating how that changed by the 1950s.
We had a question in the audience. Someone wanted to know if they actually loaded the entire Albert Hall, or if they did it more like when we're shooting here, everyone sit here and move around. And okay, so that's the answer to that.
Good question.
They manipulated the situation, definitely.
Yeah.
The answer is whatever's the cheapest to film. Okay. Money rules everything.
Because at one point in the Albert Hall scene, there's supposedly like a master shot of the whole auditorium. And if I'm not mistaken, it appears to be an optical effect where the orchestra is a separate element from the other parts of the theater. So it's put together in a special effects laboratory in that sense.
And I just want to make another comment about Hitchcock's set pieces. They occur in his best, most memorable films. You know, we have the Statue of Liberty in Saboteur, and we have the crop duster in North by Northwest, and the shower in some film. I can't remember what its name is. But I believe, along with the guy who wrote the book Hitchcock at Work, that this 12-minute plus set piece in the Albert Hall is, this author, Bill Crone, described it as the summit of Hitchcock's art. And it is just absolutely brilliant. Every time I see it, I marvel at how well thought out it is and how articulate the storytelling is without words.
Because in the original, they cut away during the key moment, right as the bullet is shot and the scream takes place, they cut to the kidnappers listening to it on the radio.
Yeah.
So they led you to this incredible moment of suspense, and then they let you down. Whereas this time Hitchcock was wise to stay in Albert Hall and stay with the Doris Day character. But it is a superb sequence.
Someone had a question if Edith Head was in charge of the costumes for this film.
I believe so.
She was at Paramount at the time.
And she was working with Hitchcock at that time. I'm going to go to IMDb, and someone else will beat me to it. But certainly Edith Head was heavily involved in most Hitchcock productions around this time.
And, you know, it's funny that you mentioned Henry Bumstead earlier, Max, because his name is on so many films, just, you know, and it's like, again, a position on the film that doesn't get held in real, you know, doesn't get touted, you know. Hitch was sort of a rare bird in his day that he was such a publicity hound and had such a name, you know. Someone else had mentioned in regard to that, you know, he really kept his presence in the public with his TV shows. And someone wanted to know if you could speak. They felt that he was more racially inclusive in his TV shows. And I was wondering if you guys could speak to that.
It's funny because I have watched all of them in sequence, and definitely as the 1960s arrive, and when you're getting into the Alfred Hitchcock hour, which was 64, 65, the last season, it's definitely becoming, you know, you are seeing more Black actors. I think that was the general lightening up of television. They never would admit to banning people of certain skin colors from television, but you were starting to see more inclusion there by the 1960s.
And I'd also want to give some credit, since Hitchcock's involvement was I don't want to minimize it too much, but he didn't run that show. Norman Lloyd and Joan Harrison were the producers. So Norman Lloyd had been sort of graylisted for a while, and that series really brought him back. And so he was very socially conscious, and I'm not saying it was all his choice. I think Max is right. It's a reflection of the era. But yeah, the last season of the Hitchcock Hour in particular also to me is incredibly dark. The stories are tragic and shocking. I'll just say a title, An Unlocked Window. If you haven't seen An Unlocked Window, if you saw it in 1965, you remembered it. It's a really shocking ending for television, and there are quite a few of those. They went to darker and darker places, and yes, the casting became more diverse, as it did on a number of other series at the time. Yeah.
And then someone wanted to know what the source of the story was from. Someone suggested that what is from a book of detective stories by G.K. Chesterton. Is that correct?
Well, what's interesting was the original film, 1934, was developed by Hitchcock and a writer as a Bulldog Drummond film. And if this were 80 years ago, everyone would say, oh, really? That would be like saying a James Bond film now to us. It was an existing character in print, on film, I think on stage, every medium. Bulldog Drummond was this British action detective of the 20s and 30s. And for some reason, I think the studio had the rights for another Bulldog Drummond film, and so Hitchcock began developing it. And as they worked on this story, they realized we don't need this to have anything to do with Bulldog Drummond. This is what it is, and it became the story that is essentially the same in both films: that a couple abroad or away from their homeland has a child kidnapped to prevent them from revealing that an assassination is going to take place. So it did have very roughly its roots in a literary figure, but departed from them long before the film was made. So yeah, it's kind of a fun story, and that's the 34 film. And Hitchcock had to work. He just he didn't like downtime. Even when he went to his home in Central California or something, he and Alma were reading all the time, trying to find their next project. And he was just so eager to get underway on something after The Trouble with Harry that was also something that would be very commercial. He said to Herbert Coleman, why don't we remake The Man Who Knew Too Much? And Herbert Coleman said, what's that? And Hitchcock was offended, but at least Herbert Coleman was, from what I understand, just a very honest man. He's like, Hitch, I'm sorry, I saw your movies, but I didn't see that one. And one has to remember that even though a movie like The Man Who Knew Too Much would play in America in 1934, just as The 39 Steps did the following year, 1935, those played in the biggest cities like New York. If you were living in the middle of the country, you didn't see those movies. So it was a long time before it was a given that a popular British movie would be shown in America.
It was a wonderful question. Someone asked how many directors remade their own films, and that person indicated DeMille, of course, did on a couple of occasions. But Howard Hawks remade Ball of Fire as a musical, A Song is Born. And you had, let's see, Lubitsch remade The Marriage Circle as 1 Hour with You. As a talkie. And there are a couple of more, but those were the big ones. And
someone asked why wasn't Hitch more involved with the TV shows? And I personally think it's because he was sort of
busy.
He was busy, and he was kind of on the back nine, and he was
he wasn't on the back nine. I forgive my taking issue with that one point, Laurie. He was absolutely working 24/7 at this time. He was traveling the world doing promotion on a film. He was overseeing the foreign versions of them. He was, the fact that you could make a movie of this scale in 1 year and then release another movie the next year, and you basically are releasing a movie a year. That could never happen in Hollywood now. He was involved with it, but he wasn't interested in doing a TV show. Right. It was agent Lou Wasserman who said, you will get $129,000 per show. And in choosing Joan Harrison and then Norman Lloyd, it was like they had his brain. They shared his brain. And everyone he put on that series knew what he liked. He knew what he didn't like, and he could go in, he could read a script, and then they saved the best scripts for him, which was the other great thing. And he loved doing the host raps for it. So he was involved in that. He loved working with a writer named James Allardyce, and James Allardyce made it a game to see if he could do something write something that Hitchcock wouldn't do. And reportedly, Hitchcock did everything from having a twin brother, Alf, to wearing a Beatles wig, to doing the silliest things, and he just loved that. So I forgive me if I misunderstood your statement, Laurie. But
I was going to say that, but he was so interested because he was busy doing other things to keep his name in the public eye. That show was really a lot about what that was about, you know.
It was about, yes, broadening his image, because prior to that TV series, he was a name, and that guy that some people knew from the cameos, but it was sort of like, oh yeah, he makes those good mystery movies. And after the TV series and the magazines that came out, the book short story collections he supposedly edited, all these other things that MCA came up with, he went from being a man concerned about his finances to having the modern equivalent of tens of millions of dollars. So he was, but he didn't. He made sure that talented people were doing it. So that's the only asterisk to that I want to add, is that he didn't just take the money and run. That all of the enterprises that had his name on them, he wanted to make sure that he had people who weren't going to let him down and were going to do good things. So that people at home who thought he directed all those shows and thought he made all those episodes wouldn't be angry at him. So,
and someone asked if the introductions on the TV shows were shot all together in bulk. I believe they would have been done per episode, because oftentimes there was some reference to the actual film that.
Well, they decided on the stories in advance. They got all the scripts together, and then he did shoot them on certain days, and just shoot many of them in a row. And those seasons, it's something like 30-something episodes a season when it's a half hour. It's an incredible amount of work. But he, there's something I was going to say about that. Oh yes, he did them for different countries also. That's how much he was concerned about appealing to an international audience. And someone pointed out that the DVD release, I think, of season 2 accidentally has the UK introductions instead of the American ones. But Hitchcock, I am in awe of how hard he worked and how seriously he took the marketing of his projects, and how, more than any other filmmaker, which is why I think he's still so popular, he found for a long time the right balance between pleasing himself as a creative force, as an artist, and also pleasing audiences. And often a project would have, like North by Northwest, would be a series of set pieces that he once said he would have happily jumped Cary Grant from one set piece to another, but he knew that wasn't a commercial film. So he hired a brilliant screenwriter, Ernest Lehman, to give him a great plot construction, terrific dialogue, and the right cast to make it a movie that it's so fun to return to.
Gerald has a question. Gerald?
Hi. Yeah, it's just real quick. The scene where Doris Day is explaining to Jimmy Stewart in Albert Hall what's going on, it was no dialogue. And I was just wondering what you guys thought of that. Was it ever done before? Haven't seen it too much since, so just curious about that.
I'll start the ball rolling by saying this is an example of a silent film director graduating to the talkies, so he was already very visually aware. Gentlemen, please continue.
Well, the story that I've read is that they actually were speaking to each other. They weren't just moving their lips, but Hitch knew that it really didn't matter what they were saying as long as they were gesturing and looking and acting the roles as they were written. So this was intended not to be used in the film, but they had to kind of use words for the actors to have something to play with each other.
I guess it didn't need to be repeated.
Yeah. It was scripted. It was scripted dialogue that was not going to be used, contrary apparently to the charming story Jimmy Stewart loved to tell, that Hitch walked over and said, "Jimmy, I don't think we need all this talking. Let's listen to this lovely music." Nice story. A lot of good stories out there, but there was scripted dialogue not to be used. There was no way Hitchcock was going to bring in dialogue at that point.
Any other questions? I think
This has been very, very exciting. Stephen and Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
I love hearing what you have. And Daniel, you just always outdo yourself with those.
Oh, yeah.
And the very personal aspect of this. And Max, with all of your erudition and knowledge, I just so appreciate the time I get to spend with you all.
One more personal thing. Guess where I was living when I saw the film for the first time? My hometown of Indianapolis, Indiana. Which is mentioned 4 or 5 times in the opening of the film. And I thought, Is there a native Hoosier who wrote the script and is plugging it? I don't know. Anyway,
Same age as Hank, where they were spying on you clearly, Dan. They wrote this movie for you.
They were saying 70 years from now they're going to be talking about us.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to turn things over to Sean tonight.
Exactly. Okay, you guys, great. Oh my goodness, we could have gone on forever. I just want to remind everyone that we're going to take a couple-week break, but on September 7th is when Stephen is doing the lecture of the War of the Worlds with Orson Welles, and that will be a fascinating lecture. I hope you can join for that. And we're going to follow it up with the discussion about the movie Citizen Kane. And again, if you've seen Citizen Kane a dozen times, this discussion will bring a lot of new light to that. So we really hope that you will join us for that as well. And you can find all of this on our website at newplazacinema.org, and you can sign up. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
And can I just mention that on previous recommendations, we saw the video of the movie The Train, and thank goodness Max Alvarez wears a tie.
Well,
he's the only one who does.
Mr. Hitchcock preferred people to dress up, but when they were filming in Marrakesh, the weather was too hot. Even Hitchcock had short sleeves. But I thought today for Hitch, I would have the tie. Thank you.
Thanks again, folks.
Okay, thanks everyone. See you soon.
Take care.